my mother, Olga Sher, was a Holocaust survivor. She rarely shared her stories with us when we were growing up, but I do remember 4 things she did tell us. 1, the family survived with the help of Felix Druszkiewicz and the Fedorov family, and some whose names she never even knew. 2, they were in a labor camp for most of the war and avoided deportation to death camps. 3, they hid in an attic for the latter part of the war. And 4, there was a near-death experience with bayonets in bales of hay. I knew there was more to her survival than these 4 things, but was always a little afraid to ask. Would I open up wounds for her? Would I make her cry? In 2002, she wrote her memoir, about 15 years before she passed. It is a small, loose-leaf bound booklet, about 30 pages long. For the last 20 years, I could not bring myself to read it, out of fear of what I might learn. So I thank Rabbi Eric and Rabbi Jenny for giving me an important reason to finally do so, to honor my mother here today and tell her full story beyond the few tidbits that I know. Picture this, a 22-year-old woman walking on the streets of post-war Krakow in 1945. Across the street, she sees a mother, about her age, pushing a baby stroller, and she thinks, life went on. Life went on for some people. But for her, life had not gone on. No school, no marriage, no babies, just survival. That woman was Olga Koretz, my mother. For her, life as she knew it had stopped in 1939. There had been a before, a during, and an after. She was born in Tarnów, Poland in 1923. Her mother, Rosalia, had traveled to Tarnów to be there with her own mother to give birth to her first child. About a week later, my grandfather, Joseph, traveled to Tarnów to meet his little girl and to bring the family home to Borisław. 5 years later, after the birth of her sister, Ilona, the family moved to Warsaw because my grandfather had been promoted. Joseph Koretz worked for a plumbing supply company owned by his brother-in-law. He had a white-collar job, and the family was quite comfortable. The Koretz family, like many middle-class Jews in Poland, was also quite secular. Warsaw, a much larger city than Borisław, presented cultural and educational opportunities, a school with both a French and Polish curriculum, ballet lessons and piano lessons. Olga and Irena went swimming at a sports club and attended concerts and the theater. Summer vacations were spent at seaside resorts where the girls swam and Rosalia enjoyed the spa. Winter vacations were spent in the mountains where the entire family skied. Joseph had been an officer in the Polish army, and he instilled discipline and athleticism in his girls, traits they passed on to their children. The family were victims of anti-Semitism early on in Warsaw. Olga was the only Jew in her class, and teachers had no worries about humiliating her. Her memory of ballet class was that she was largely ignored. News from Germany was largely dismissed. A German Jewish doctor who made house calls to the family gave detailed information about the situation there. My grandparents thought, not here. Joseph was very proud of his service in the army and could not fathom that fellow Poles would dishonor him in any way. But the siege of Warsaw began with huge aerial bombardments on September 1st, 1939, following the Nazi invasion of Poland. Land fighting started on September 8th, and the military operation lasted until September 28th, when the Polish garrison capitulated. On October 1st, the Wehrmacht entered Warsaw, which started a period of German occupation that lasted 5 years until the heroic but doomed Warsaw Uprising in August of 1944. The Koretz family had been vacationing at a resort on the Baltic Sea in September 1939 when the siege of Warsaw had begun, and they returned to Warsaw immediately. Like thousands leaving the city, they made their way to the train station. Their evacuation was made easier because my grandfather proudly wore his uniform, a belted tunic with matching trousers and his officer's cap. It still counted for something. At least for now, the Polish population still respected the uniform, especially that of an officer. They were able to board a train, but soon the overcrowded train was bombed, and they were all thrown onto a potato field below the tracks. The low-flying planes killed or wounded many in the field, but the Koretz family survived intact and continued their journey. They spent the next 3 weeks moving east on any available transportation. During those 3 weeks, they met Felix Druszkiewicz, a former colleague of my grandfather. They had worked together at the plumbing supplies company. Mr. Druszkiewicz's army division had been dissolved, and he was destitute after evacuating Warsaw. My grandmother chose to give him some food and some money, though they did not have much of their own at the time. This small act of kindness would be repaid in a way none of them could ever imagine at that time. The Koretz family made it to Lvov, and after almost a year there, sheltering with Rosalia's family, they returned to Borisław in the spring of 1940, as Joseph had found work at a branch of the same plumbing firm. Although life felt stable again, it also felt temporary. And on July 1st, 1941, the German army arrived, victorious, well-dressed, singing and laughing. The Germans publicly proclaimed free play for 24 hours. No crime against Jews would be punished, no matter how egregious. The Koretz family escaped by hiding in barns and bathrooms, listening to the mob steal anything they could carry. 350 Jews were murdered that night. The dead were given a Jewish burial in the Jewish cemetery as soon as it was safe to do so. The cemetery was later destroyed, and today it is a gas station. No gravestones mark the grounds of the 350 Jews. Shortly after occupying Borisław, the Germans moved the Jews to a ghetto. My mother and grandfather had working papers and were able to get jobs at the Beskidian Oil Company, renamed the Carpathian Oil Company. But Rosalia and Irena had no jobs and were vulnerable to deportations. When a large transport loomed, it was decided that Olga would take them to the Fedorovs' farm, about 2 miles from the ghetto. A few words about the Fedorovs. When the Koretz family first arrived back in Borisław in 1940, Olga had attended high school for a short time, and it was there that she met 2 sisters, Janka and Eva. Eva, a courageous young woman, later joined the Polish resistance. The entire Fedorov family of devout Catholics unhesitatingly provided assistance to my mother's family. At great risk, my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother walked to the Fedorovs after they removed their yellow Star of David armbands. On their approach, they did notice a man looking on suspiciously. The Fedorovs asked no questions and hurriedly took Rosalia and Irena straight to their barn while Olga returned to the ghetto. Rosalia and Irena climbed into the hayloft and buried themselves under the hay. Alas, that onlooker had alerted the Gestapo, and they soon arrived, turning the house over, shouting, "Where are the Jews? Where are the Jews?" A soldier climbed up the ladder in the barn and jabbed violently around in the straw with his bayonet. The tip was inches away from Irena and Rosalia, but he did not find them. For the next 3 days and nights, the entire Fedorov family, Janka and Eva, their mother Aniela, Janka's husband Edward, and their 3rd sister Maria, chose to care for the Jewish women despite the terror everyone was experiencing. They brought them food and encouragement, removed their waste, and protected them. After a few days, Rosalia and Irena were able to return to the ghetto. Bertold Bates was the business manager at the oil company where Olga and Joseph worked. Like Schindler, he relied on Jewish workers. The Jews that he rescued from deportation included many unqualified workers, some in poor physical condition, who could not, by any stretch of the imagination, be described as professionals or indispensable to the oil industry. Bates also placed himself at considerable risk by passing on inside information of impending deportations and executions to his Jewish confidants. To protect the indispensable Jewish employees from the raids carried out by the SS, the Carpathian Oil Company housed them and their families in segregated work camps. In the spring of 1943, the Koretz family left the ghetto and moved to the oil company's work camp. Olga, Irena, and their parents continued to have some luck. They had their own room with a small kitchen and could have their meals in their own quarters. But the camp was always heavily guarded, and when Olga and Joseph walked to work each day, it was under the watchful eyes of German guards. In 1944, with the Russians advancing, roundups and deportations became an almost daily occurrence in the ghetto and in the camps, and the threat hung heavily over everyone. In the spring, the chief of the Gestapo had arrived and announced pending deportations of the Jews to protect them from the Soviet army. My grandfather believed it was time to find another hideout for Irena and Rosalia. This time, an attic was discovered in town, but the owners only agreed to hide them for a fee. This is where Felix Druskevich returns the small favor my grandmother had bestowed on him. He supplies the payment for hiding the family in the attic, and Eva Fredorov brings that money from Warsaw every month. They both chose to do this, even at great risk to themselves. As news of the Russian offensive grows, the supervision at the work camp grows lax. It is decided that my mother should go visit her mother and her sister in their hiding place. Olga sneaks out for what she believes is just a short visit. But once there, Eva delivers a message from Joseph. Do not return to camp. There are rumors that a freight train is at the station to deport everyone from the camp. The next day, a note from Eva says that she saw Joseph walking to the train station. Now the three women are terrified for him, but he showed up the next morning. A German colleague from the oil company had helped him sneak through a hole in the fence. Another who made a choice to be courageous and humane. For the first time in a few months, the family was together again. One day, an electrician was called to install a bell, and the family hid in a storage closet partitioned in a corner of the attic. The electrician followed the electric wires in the attic and through the cracks in the partition saw 4 pairs of frightened eyes. Stunned, he turned around and walked away. He was supposed to return the next day, but he never came back to finish the work. The Koretz family did not know what to do. They decided not to say anything to their landlord and hoped the electrician would not denounce them. He did not. He made a heroic choice that had consequences beyond those 4 Koretz family members. All communications and contact between the Koretz family while they were separated, and then between them and the outside world when they were all hiding in the attic for the final 4 months of the year, were provided by Eva, who stayed by their side throughout the ordeal and brought what food and news she could. On Thursday, May 24th, 1944, my grandfather spent his 40th birthday in the attic. My grandmother had asked the landlady to bring lilacs from the garden, as the family knew that it was spring outside. 2.5 months later, on August 8th, 1944, the Russians liberated Borisov. The landlord opened the door and told Joseph, "The Russians are here now. You can leave. But your family must stay until it gets dark. I don't want my neighbors to see that I was hiding Jews." The Polish truck driver and his Ukrainian wife who hid them were considered helpers by Yad Vashem, but not righteous, as their motivation was pure personal financial gain. Although the Koretz family was now free, the Russians were suspicious of any surviving Jews, believing they had cooperated with the Germans. Food is scarce, and the family relies on the kindness of former neighbors or strangers for places to stay. Eventually, some sort of normalcy returns, though the anti-Semitism is still felt. Jews are afraid to return to the small villages they left during the war. A post-war pogrom in Kilche had resulted in the massacre of 40 survivors, accused of blood libel, an anti-Semitic trope accusing Jews of the ritualistic killing of Christian youth in order to use their blood for religious purposes. In May of 1945, the family moved to Krakow, a beautiful city untouched by the war. But the Koretz family does not feel safe in Poland and makes plans to emigrate to Canada, where Rosalia's sister has lived since before the war. Although the Polish bureaucracy presented numerous challenges, in 1949, the family arrived in Canada after a 2-week voyage. They were safe at last. For the first few years in Montreal, the family finds work to become financially independent of their Canadian relatives. Olga as a lab technician, Joseph as a bookkeeper, Irena in a business office, and Rosalia crochets for pocket money. Joseph and Rosalia befriended many Polish Jewish immigrants and recreated their European lifestyle, meeting friends for coffee on Saturday afternoons and vacationing in lakeside resorts like Lake Placid. 2 years after arriving in Montreal, Olga met Ben Sher, a Canadian born to Russian immigrants. My Bubby and Zadie had emigrated to escape the pogroms in their home country. 6 months after they met, Ben and Olga are married, a union that lasted 55 years until Ben's death in 2006. They gifted their 3 children, me, my older brother Julian, and our younger brother Emil, with a love of reading, learning, and tikkun olam. Olga stayed home until Emil started kindergarten and then started work as a teacher to match the children's school hours. She left that first teaching job for one as a special education teacher in the Department of Child Psychiatry at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal and eventually completed a master's degree in special ed while working full-time and raising her 3 children. She worked in the child psychiatry department for 36 years, and the hospital dedicated a playground in her honor for her inspiration and creativity. My grandfather's love of skiing had been passed on to Olga, and my brothers and I all went to ski school. To this day, my 70-year-old brother, Julian, has an annual pass for Mont Tremblant. In the 1970s, my mother and I attended exercise classes at the YMYWHA, and we became runners together, completing several 10K races and enjoying long runs on Mount Royal in Montreal. My brothers eventually got the running bug as well, and the 3 of us completed 3 marathons together. This fall, Emil will complete his 22nd marathon at the age of 64. Ben and Olga were lifelong learners and both participated in and then led courses at the Thomas More Institute, a secular liberal arts academic institution that offers university-level discussion courses. For half a century, Olga led discussions in history, philosophy, and the fate of the earth. And in her 90s, she moved the discussion circles to seniors' residences. The Institute presented her with a Lifelong Learning Award in 2014. When my father had a leg amputated and was confined to a wheelchair, they determined they could no longer endure the Montreal winters. Olga retired from the Jewish General Hospital at the age of 71 and my parents became snowbirds, wintering in Lighthouse Point, Florida, from January through March. Of course, while there, they volunteered at the local public library and attended courses at a local university. And they did all of this without a car because neither had ever learned to drive. When in Montreal, Olga volunteered as a docent at the Montreal Holocaust Memorial Center. She learned to tell her story in ways that were meaningful to school children. As a colleague from the center remembered, when she looked at you, you could feel her kindness, and when she told her story, you couldn't help but be pulled in. She had a talent for helping you understand what the Holocaust meant for humanity. My mother remembered a professor in Poland asking how she could manage in university after the war. Manage, she thought? I wanted to make sure that I had heard right. After all we had been through, I knew in my heart that in the future, I would be able to manage anything and overcome any obstacle. But my mother's past was always with her. As my brother Julian said in her obituary, like many war survivors, you always felt she could never quite shake the dread. So she was forever saving flattened sheets of used aluminum foil, plastic wrapping, bags and containers. Nothing should be thrown away, all neatly put away because you never know when you might need it. Our family lore includes jokes about what we might find in the plastic containers in the fridge. The yogurt, as described on the label, or leftover chicken. Nothing was too small to keep. What did my mother's survival mean for me? She was a serious person, as I am, but she also modeled strength and warmth. I competed for my first IT job as the lone female in a group of 12 men, trained for and ran my first marathon in New York City at the age of 31, and welcomed being a stepmom at the age of almost 40. My mother's legacy is greater than that, however. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren from my bonus family all love to read, learn, and exercise. They are working to improve people's lives in many ways, through medical data analysis, social work, nutrition and fitness, and documentary filmmaking. And there are soccer players, cyclists, runners, skiers, horseback riders, and physical fitness trainers among them. There is always something more to understand, another article to read, another movie to watch, another goal to reach, another walk to take, another hand to hold. My grandmother's undying spirit taught us that. So said her granddaughter, Miriam Tremblay Sher, at her funeral. If you have grandparents living today, ask them for their stories. Or if you are a grandparent, share your stories with your grandchildren. Stories connect us and build empathy and understanding. In this age of sharing photos and videos, the emotional engagement that comes from just talking and listening can get lost. Try not to let that happen. Find the time to share your stories. It is a miracle that I am here today to tell my mother's story, the improbable consequences of courageous choices made by some people, including strangers, resulted in my mother's survival. My mother honored Felix Drushkevich and the entire Fedorov family in the Righteous Among the Nations at Yad Vashem. And I'm honored to have shared her story with you all today. And again, thank the rabbis for this opportunity.